The basis of his recent book, Eating Tomorrow: Agribusiness, Family Farmers, and the Battle for the Future of Food, published by the New Press. His research has taken him from Iowa to India, Mexico to Mozambique, and demonstrates how influence by agribusiness is driving policies that leave us eating our collective tomorrows. Small-scale farmers have the key to a climate-resilient, food-secure future. Timothy has a long history of collaboration with the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy, excuse me, on issues including agricultural dumping, U.S. agricultural subsidies and policies, responses to the 2007-2008 global food crisis, the World Trade Organization, and Mexico under NAFTA. He's a senior advisor with the Small Planet Institute, where he directed the Land and Food Rights Program from 2013 to 2020. He's also a senior research fellow at Tufts University's Global Development and Environment Institute, where he founded and directed its Globalization and Sustainable Development Program. He previously served as executive director of the US-based aid agency Grassroots International. In addition to his new book, Eating Tomorrow, he is the author of Confronting Globalization: Economic Integration and Popular Resistance in Mexico, and co-author of The Promise and the Perils of Agricultural Trade Liberalization. Timothy is a sought-after speaker and frequent contributor to the media with commentaries in many publications, including Wired, Vice, The American Prospect, Yes Magazine, and international media. I now have the honor to introduce our presenter, Timothy Wise. Thank you.
Right. Good job. Thanks so much. It is really a pleasure to be here. I hope everyone can hear me, and I'm coming through clearly. I know we're all used to Zoom by now, but only uncomfortably. That's true for me as a speaker as well. I really miss the opportunity to be with you in person and to get to know you and meet you. But I think what we've all realized, those of us who give talks like this, is that Zoom is far better than nothing. And so I've really grown to appreciate the opportunity to connect with people I haven't met before in communities like yours. So thank you for having me. And I'll say that I'm a little, I send my own personal message of solidarity to you, those of you in the Minneapolis area, for the difficult moments that I know you're living through and have been for the last year in particular. All our eyes are there and our hearts are there too, hoping for the best. I'm pleased to get to talk about my book, which when the pandemic hit, I had a pretty extensive book tour planned, all of which got canceled. So it's great to get back to talking about it. I was very pleased with the book. If you talk to a lot of authors, you'll find that they aren't always pleased with the books that get produced for them, but this book is a very pretty book that New Press produced, and I think it really holds up well now. It actually, I ended up particularly happy with the title, which has a funny story behind it. My colleague and one of my mentors and inspiration, Frances Moore Lappé, the author of Diet for a Small Planet and many other books. Before working with IATP, I was at the Small Planet Institute, her institute in Cambridge. And she agreed to meet me and talk to me about my book proposal early on. And I didn't have a good working title. And she gave me very good advice about the book, which has made it a much better book. You won't know that she had that influence, but I do. But we brainstormed titles. She's written 18 books, well, now 19 now. So she's good at books. She's good at book titles. We didn't come up with anything we really liked for a book title. And I'm walking home from our lunch meeting in Cambridge, and my phone rings, and I answer it, and it was Frankie. And I said, "Hi, Frankie." And she said, "Hey, Tim, what about eating tomorrow?" And I literally said to her, I was confused, and I said, "Well, I really enjoyed our lunch, Frankie. I could do it again tomorrow if you want." And she said, "No, no, no, your book, the title of your book, Eating Tomorrow." And that's literally where the title of the book came from. Um, I really like it. It's grown on me as a title for the book because I think the double meaning really captures what I was trying to communicate, that humanity faces a continuing challenge to make sure everyone achieves the right to food in a very unequal society. And climate change makes the challenge of achieving that all the more difficult. But the way we're producing our food on chemical intensive industrial scale farms is quite literally devouring the natural resource base, the soil, the climate, the water, the seeds on which future food production depends. And by continuing and expanding that model and trying to export it to places like Africa, we're eating our collective tomorrows. I wrote the book because with 30 years in this field, I really wanted to understand why policymakers were following that path and ignoring all of the low-cost, effective, ecological opportunities and models that were being offered by their own small-scale farmers around the world, and instead doubling down on this destructive model of agriculture. The subtitle, Agribusiness, Family Farmers, and the Battle for the Future of Food, kind of summarizes my diagnosis of the problem, that there is indeed a battle for the future of food. It's largely to try to overcome the influence of agribusiness in dominating the policy choices that are being made on behalf of all of us, and much to our detriment. The underlying question that the book in a way is trying to answer is sort of the grand question of how will we feed the world? That's what everyone asks, and started asking more in 2007 and 8 when we had those food price spikes and warnings of food shortages, and suddenly all the Malthusian warnings about how maybe we'd finally reached the limits of our natural resource base. It's how will we feed the world is an important question. I argue it's an important question with a lot of very bad answers, and almost all of those bad answers are that we just need to grow more food. And that's as wrong now as it was 50 years ago when Frances Moore Lappé wrote Diet for a Small Planet. She showed that hunger is not a product of a shortage of food. It's almost always a product of a shortage of power over cash or over food producing resources on the part of the poor. It's a distributional problem. And that's very true today. If you look, ever since, for the last 3 or 4 years, we've been in what agricultural experts call a global grain glut. If you ask farmers in Minnesota, they'll tell you that crop prices have generally been very poor for the last 4 or 5 years, and that's because we're producing far more of these commodities than we need. And yet, at the same time that we have that global grain glut, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations has documented 5 straight years of rising world hunger. Hunger increasing such that there are now more than 800 million people around the world who are considered to be severely and chronically hungry. Another billion suffer from some form of malnutrition. So the food system is clearly not working for the way it's supposed to, and growing more food isn't the answer to that. Francis Moore Lappé called it the paradox of hunger amid plenty. And that beat goes on. And the question is, why do we keep getting it so wrong? And that's why I wrote this book, thinking that growing more food will solve the hunger problem. And one of the reasons that we keep getting it so wrong is that the question itself, how will we feed the world, is kind of fundamentally flawed. And if you think about it, deeply arrogant as well, because there's no we who feeds the world. When people ask that question, they're clearly implying that the we is the rich countries with their industrialized agriculture producing huge surpluses, and that we're the ones who are feeding the hungry. Nothing could be further from the truth. 70% of the food consumed in developing countries is grown by farmers in those countries. And most of that is grown by small-scale farmers in those countries. And there, in that sense, there is no abstract world out there passively waiting to be fed by this charitable global north, the rich countries. There are about 1 billion people who are chronically hungry, and the majority of them, and this is the great paradox, are farmers or in farming communities. Farmers are not waiting passively to be fed. They're actively trying to feed themselves and their communities. And that's the ultimate paradox, right? Food producers going hungry. The obvious answer is to put those food producers in a better position to grow more food for themselves and their communities. But what I saw in country after country as I traveled the world to do the research for this book is that policymakers are doing no such thing. And why? I concluded that doing so would cut into the profits of agribusiness firms, and that agribusiness firms were really dominating the policy process. And that's as true in Minnesota and Iowa as it is in Mozambique. So what I'll do with the rest of this talk, Eating Tomorrow is a first-person narrative account. I try to take you with me around the world as I try to figure out what's going on. It's filled with stories, with characters. It has not one graph or table, which is a trained economist, or as I say, a recovering economist, is step 4 in the 12-step program for getting over economic training. But what I thought I'd do is share some of what you'll find in Eating Tomorrow, not a complete complete presentation at all. My travels took me to Mexico, to India, several countries in Southern Africa, Malawi, Mozambique, Tanzania, and Zambia, and to the heartland. A couple chapters are devoted to Iowa, because I wanted to find out where this model started and why we're exporting it to the rest of the world. Africa is where the battle for the future of food is the most urgent, so I'll start there. It's where hunger is the most severe. It's where soils are the most degraded. Farming is the least productive. It's also where climate change is expected to have the most devastating impact on farming. And it's where the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and donor governments are aggressively exporting that industrial model of agriculture. Let me start in Malawi, and I'll switch to a PowerPoint so you can meet some of the people that I met along the way. I'm trying to see if I can still share my screen. There we go. There we go. Can you all see that fine?
Yes.
Good. So let me start in Malawi. Malawi was considered a Green Revolution miracle. The Green Revolution was the system first developed for India of using so-called high-yield commercial breeds of crops with large amounts of fertilizer and other chemicals. And it's credited with dramatically increasing food production in India. There's some debate about how true that is, but I won't go into that right now. It largely passed Africa by when it took India in the 1960s and 70s. And so the Gates Foundation and others thought now is the time to give Africa its very own green revolution with seeds adapted to its climates and with large public support. They founded the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa, which has now spent $1 billion since 2006 promoting this so-called modernization of systems. What it means in practice in a place like Malawi, which is a small landlocked country on the southeastern edge of Africa, very poor, one of the poorest countries in the world, is that the government is spending, in some years, 60% of its agricultural budget to subsidize the purchase of seeds and fertilizers by small-scale farmers. The government decided to do that after they'd had 2 or 3 straight years of crop shortfalls and famine, serious hunger that required food aid to be shipped in. They decided, over and above the objections of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, who thought the government should never subsidize anything, that they'd had it, that they were going to ignore that advice and subsidize their farmers. Farmers get coupons that give them 75 to 100% discounts on the purchase of seeds and fertilizers. What's remarkable about this story is that they were considered a miracle because in the first years after they started that program, they doubled their production of their main staple, corn, and hunger went down. But when I got there, the model was really unraveling, and in predictable ways, because as any crop scientist will tell you, synthetic fertilizers do nothing for the long-term fertility of the soil. They nourish the plant, not the soil. And land planted year after year in the same monoculture of corn start to demand more and more fertilizer just to maintain the yields that they've had up to then. That's what was happening in Malawi. I've said that pouring chemical fertilizer on monocropped corn is a little bit like putting trout in a trout pond in the spring. Sure, people can go and fish trout out of that pond later in the summer, but the pond is not sustaining aquatic life. It's being stocked every year, and fertilizer is stocking the land so that farmers can pull some corn out of it. That does not make the land more fertile. In fact, it makes it less fertile over time. It grows acidic. Yields tend to plateau, flatten out, and then it requires farmers to buy more and more fertilizer just to maintain their yields, which they can't afford. So today, Malawi shows very little sign of improvement in basic hunger indicators. If you look at that second set of bullet points, rural poverty remains over 50%, undernourishment at 20%, children underweight, a main measure of of nutrition, 17%, and child stunting, 42% of children stunted. That's height for their age. So what happened to this miracle? What I was able to see in Malawi as I traveled around is that the alternatives to these kinds of policies are everywhere, and they're showing far more promise. I had spent a lot of time with the Malawi farmer-to-farmer Agro-ecology project in the central region of Lobi. There, farmers have found a local bright orange variety of maize, of corn, that is high in vitamin A. Vitamin A is a chronic deficiency in developing countries. It causes blindness and other long-term maladies in children. So vitamin A is much sought after. They found this local variety of corn that they started improving by careful seed selection and then propagating among their farmers and then neighboring communities. They don't have to buy the seeds every year like they did with the subsidy program, and it doesn't need a lot of fertilizer, the same kind of fertilization that the commercial varieties need to grow. In fact, they were trained. It's an interesting project because it was started by nutritionists, and the main goal was to improve crop diversity as a way to improve diet diversity. This is very common in a lot of places I've been, and very effective, because a diet dominated by corn and not much else is not a healthy diet. So they went in and they taught farmers how to expand the number of crops they plant in their fields, to intercrop, to do multiple cropping in the same field, planting, for example, pigeon peas, a legume, with their corn. That builds soil fertility over time. It diversifies their risk, because if they get if they lose their maize their corn to some kind of an infestation, they still have their pigeon peas. And it builds climate resilience, because with weather being so much more unpredictable, rains being unpredictable, droughts more common, heat waves, floods with sudden storms, they're much more resilient to that kind of disruption. They found that nutrition went up dramatically. The children were much healthier. Farmers' costs of production went down because they weren't having to buy these expensive inputs, and their disposable incomes went up. That is exactly the kind of win-win-win solution that everybody says they want, right? They started producing a whole variety of different products from their farms. I was shown a buffet when I visited once of all the crops, all the food preparations they learned to make. The most delicious sweet potato donuts you've ever eaten, and they were now eating much healthier food. Now you'd think, again, this is the premise of my book, you would think that there would be, that the government would look at this and go, wow, here's a low-cost solution that relies on a natural native input, this native variety of corn. Farmers don't have to pay for it. It doesn't take this expensive fertilizer. The communities are healthier. This is where we should put our money. But no, instead the government follows the Gates Foundation's prescriptions to reform its seed policy in a way that gives commercial crop breeders like Monsanto greater rights to the distribution of their commercial seeds in Malawi, and threatened in its first draft to make it illegal for farmers to save, exchange, and sell these native seeds. 80% of the food grown in Africa is grown by saved seed and exchange seed that farmers save from harvest to harvest. So this is a direct assault on the main way that Africa feeds itself in the name of modernization. This policy was so egregious and so extreme that it actually said that these kind of seeds, native seeds, couldn't even be called seeds anymore. They could only be called grain, implying that they were only worthy of eating, but not of planting. I had one farmer hold up a bright orange grain of this corn and say to me, "We've been planting this for generations. How can this not be a seed?" But that was the policy. I actually was arguing later over dinner with one of the defenders of the policy in Malawi, and I got exasperated with him. And I said, "Tamani, the way this policy reads, it could have been written by Monsanto." And he literally looked down at his shoes and looked back up and said sheepishly, "Well, a former Monsanto official was one of the authors of the policy." I'm glad to say that my report of that involvement by Monsanto was a little bit of a scandal in Malawi, and it did prompt some reforms to that seed policy that took out some of the worst provisions. So they're still battling over ensuring farmers' rights to save, exchange, and sell their seeds. But the companies and the philanthropic allies like the Gates Foundation are determined to open Africa to these seed giants. And they've really captured most of these African governments. This is Evelyn Jolomole from that community in Lobi, who has the beautiful orange maize. They had a display in the capital city of Lilongwe that I was there for. And this is President Peter Mutharika, who is stopping by the booth, and she handed him a packet of the flour made from the orange maize. And she said he looked at it and said, "Oh, is this from Monsanto?" As if Monsanto was could be the only possible source of something innovative in that society. She saw herself on television that night, actually, explaining that no, this was a natural resource that could solve food insecurity in Malawi. One of the other topics that I cover in my coverage of Africa is land grabbing, and you may have heard a lot about this because after the price spikes of 2007 and 8, there was a wave of governments and companies going into Africa and other places and trying to secure huge tracts of land to grow food for export. They said it was food for the local economy, but of course it never was. I saw a lot of this in Malawi, but also I covered it more closely in Tanzania, Zambia, and Mozambique. A lot of these projects, I'm glad to say, never got off the ground because of protest at the local level, because their business plans were ridiculous. This is a rice farm that I covered in Chinese-owned rice farm that I covered in Mozambique. I mentioned that these projects were failing, and a Harvard Business School colleague said to me, "Well, the majority of startups fail. Why should farms be any different?" And in fact, that's true. It's only one of the many myths about these kind of land acquisitions. I mean, they rarely take over unoccupied land. They claim that they're taking unoccupied, unused land, but they aren't, and they displace people. There's rarely consultation with the affected communities. They're just kicked off. These are capital-intensive projects, so they don't create many jobs, and they usually displace more farmers from their livelihoods than they create jobs. And they mostly don't grow food. That's the most egregious part. They grow biofuel crops or flex crops like sugar or soybeans or oil seeds, or cash crops like bananas or mangoes for export. And one of the other myths is the main perpetrator isn't China. It's, even though this project I looked at was Chinese capital, it's the US and the British are the biggest investors in these land grabs. Like I said, the projects often fail, and that's what I saw in a lot of places, but the land is almost never returned to farmers when it fails. I followed this Chinese rice company. They'd been granted a long-term lease on 50,000 acres of irrigated land in Xai-Xai, which is an area about 3 hours up the coast from Maputo, the capital city of Mozambique. And the company plowed right through farmers' fields. Angelica Moyane was one of the leaders of the Farmer Federation and the resistance to this land grab. And she told me the damages. She watched bulldozers destroy her ripe corn crops and vegetable crops and plow right through. They protested and stopped the bulldozers. They eventually organized a protest in the regional capital, saying no to Wanbao. Wanbao is the Chinese company that was grabbing the land. They did manage to stop that particular, the taking of these community members' lands, but they didn't stop the project. The project went on, and the project eventually failed, like so many of them fail, because it's just badly designed. They don't have a good business plan, and their technology isn't actually very appropriate for the local conditions. And so I asked these farmers after the project was clearly going to fail, I said, well, what do you want them to do with the land? And you'd be surprised how rarely anyone ever asks locals what they want, right? They were very clear. They said, give the land back to the communities and let us grow food. And that's actually what the local farmers in Xai-Xai are taking steps to do. They formed a farmers association called, giving it the name of Sakane, which means happy in their language. And they've petitioned for 750 acres of land for their members to grow food and to do it ecologically. Learning from other farmers in Mozambique how to do that. So these are women in Xai-Xai, overwhelmingly women, doing this protesting and leading these associations, who are really trying to show the way forward. They're basically asking a simple question. If you want to feed the hungry, why not give us food producers good land so we can grow more food? Very simple question, almost never gets a very good answer. That's a very good answer that's the Farmers Association that, actually that's their founding meeting. It's where they meet, it's out by the fields. That question is a very good one for the government of Zambia, where 78% of the rural population lives in extreme poverty, despite a tripling of corn production under this Green Revolution model. Hunger amid plenty. Many are poor because they don't have enough land. I was visiting Wilfred Monga, who has about 12 acres and does okay, but he worries that there won't be land for his daughter. This is Machila, when she grows up. And that's partly because the Zambian government, instead of doing what the Mozambican women demanded, give the food producers more land, are actually reserving land in 250,000 acre farm blocks for foreign investors to come in and, again, modernize agricultural production in Mozambique. And if you think about it, and you think about a farming household like this, 250,000 acres could give 25,000 farm families 10 acres each. In a place like Mozambique, 10 acres, or Zambia, 10 acres is a good amount of land. It's enough to grow enough to feed your family. It's enough to grow a surplus to sell on the market. to earn money to invest in improving the farm, to send your kids to school, all the things that look like agricultural development is supposed to look, but not if you're reserving all your best land for foreign companies. The other place where that's the other cause of land grabbing is biofuel production. And I saw this firsthand in Kisarawe, Tanzania, where a British venture capital firm, Sun Biofuels, was investing in jatropha. Jatropha is an African plant that grows oil seeds, and the theory was that, like corn and African palm and sugar and soybeans, it can be turned into biodiesel for export. This project had failed by the time I got to Kisarawe, and it had failed miserably. They'd taken 20,000 acres of villagers' land with their consent on the promise of all kinds of rural development that was going to be given to the community. Clinics, roads, schools, wells, all kinds of needed improvements. And the villagers got none of it. They didn't get any jobs because the thing shut down. And they didn't get their land back when it failed, because after projects fail, they rarely get their land back. The lease was passed along to another venture capitalist, and with absolutely no attention to the promises that had been made to secure that land in the first place. In the Polochek Valley of Guatemala, this was a land grab for sugar, and these women are looking out on the land that used to be theirs but was taken for sugar. Again, sugar for ethanol production in this case. And the boom for these kinds of products at a large scale in Guatemala has farmers literally growing corn on median strips in cities because they can't even find land they can rent. That's how serious the land grabbing has gotten in a place like Guatemala. Another theme that runs through the book is climate change, and that's as true in Iowa and the Midwest as it is in a place like Mozambique. I was struck that I was giving a book talk in March 2019 in Iowa, and at the time I really focus on 6 countries in the course of this book, and 2 of them were underwater from floods caused by climate change. Iowa was, and Mozambique was. Mozambique was obviously in much worse shape as a much poorer country that was hit by the largest storm the east coast of Africa had ever seen. It was such a catastrophic cyclone that it left an inland sea of flooding 100 miles long. More than 1,000 people died. Many more bodies were never recovered, and tens of thousands were left homeless. And this in one of the poorest countries on the planet. And it came at harvest time, which in this rural agricultural area meant that the one source of food that farmers had ready to be harvested was gone. I heard a lot about climate change in the course of my research, learning that in places like Southern Africa, it is not a future threat. It's a clear and very present danger. I've spent a lot of time in a community called Marakwene, which is about 45 minutes up the coast from Maputo in Mozambique. And in Marakwene, they had withstood an astonishing roller coaster of climate events. And they'd withstood it, they told me, because they are 7,000 farmers, overwhelmingly women, grouped in 19 farmers associations, part of the National Peasant Union of Mozambique. And they have been farming ecologically for years. So they credit their resilience in the face of these events to that kind of farming. But the roller coaster is mind-boggling for anyone who's had any contact with farming. Just imagine. Since 2012, they started to get very heavy rain, and they saw that their one rainy season that they depended on to grow their crops was growing more erratic. It would come later, it would be shorter, it would stop in the middle. It wasn't dependable. Very hard if you're rain-fed agriculture. In 2014, they got very late rains and a drought. The crops went in late. Heat, which we started calling it climate change and stopped calling it global warming. It's global warming. The heat is a big, big issue in places like this. Tropical climates, not used to seeing 100 degrees Fahrenheit in the growing season, and they saw that, and they lost maize crops to it. The next year, a second year of drought, they're lucky enough to have irrigation there from the nearby Inkomati River, but the Inkomati River dried up in the second year of drought. And as if that's not bad enough, the Indian Ocean, just 3 miles downriver to the coast, and swelled by rising sea levels, flowed back up the dry riverbed and infiltrated their irrigation channels, poisoning their land with salt water. When I was there 2 years ago, they were still not growing on some of that land as they waited for the salt to leach out. Again, a climate impact that I could hardly have imagined. They were lucky and well prepared because they had their own seed banks. They had saved seeds in a community seed bank in the event of disaster, and this allowed them to grow out new crops of maize, of corn, to give them as seed to their member farmers. So they weren't in danger in the next crop year. But the hits just kept on coming. And one year it hit 110 degrees, and they said they just watched the corn wilt in their fields. I would ask these farmers if they were okay, and they said yes, year after year, and they credit their ecological farming. Again, like the project that I showed you in Malawi, they were intercropping a variety of crops. They'd been doing it for years. Their soil was very rich. It held water pretty well, so you didn't lose as much in a drought. And they had a variety of crops. So if one crop failed, they could harvest sweet potato and yucca if they didn't have corn. And their soils have been improved. So when water is scarce, it holds the water. When they get floods, the topsoil doesn't wash away. This woman, Florentina Samuel, is a farmer in the Popular Farmers Association, and she said, we're still suffering, but if the next crop is good, we'll be okay because the soil is better now. These, again, are farmers who are not devouring the resource base on which they depend for their food. They're restoring it so that they can eat more and healthier food tomorrow. This is her beautiful field, just ready at the beginning of her planting. It shamed me so much about my backyard garden that I came home committed to making my backyard garden look a little bit more like this, with nice raised beds and beautifully intercropped plants. Let me conclude talking a little bit about Iowa, because that's where this model comes from, and climate change is doing a number on the Midwest as well as on Southern Africa, and more, right? You all have seen that in Minnesota, I'm sure. I mean, every piece of the industrial agricultural model is both implicated in and threatened by climate change. And the floods that we've seen in recent years are just one example of that. Iowa has lost half of its topsoil. 100-year floods now happen every 20, 25 years. No one really knows. There's less to hold the soil in place on most farms and more to wash away. And so when the storms come, they lose even more. The sediments flow down the waterways and off the drainage tiles and into the Des Moines River and into the Mississippi and down to contribute to the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. Iowa's losing soil, they estimate 4 times faster than it can grow it. The University of Minnesota researchers have estimated that by 2075, corn yields will probably be 20 to 50% lower than they are now due to climate change. They're depleting their freshwater resources, their aquifers. The Jordan and Dakota aquifers are being pumped at unsustainable rates, not for corn, which is not irrigated, but for meat and ethanol. It takes 5 gallons of water a day to raise a hog. It takes 3 gallons of water to distill a gallon of ethanol from corn. That's 40 billion gallons a year just for ethanol and pork. At current growth rates, they're projected to run dry in the future. And of course, the water quality is abysmal from runoff and the rest. And the Des Moines Waterworks treatment facility is always on the verge of shutting off Des Moines' water supply because of excess pollution in the water. But even as bad as I saw it in Iowa, another Iowa is indeed possible, as I was convinced by Matt Liebman. He's a Iowa State researcher and scientist, and he's for, I think it's 20 years now, maintained this experimental farm called the Marsden Farm, in which he cultivates the usual crop mix of corn and soybeans in the usual ways. And then he has experimental farms in which he tries different forms of farming to see how they compare. And what he's shown is that on this farm, by adding 1 rotation to the usual corn-soy rotation, by adding hay or alfalfa or another grass crop, they have reduced fertilizer use by 85% on the farm, cut herbicide use by 97%, eliminated water pollution from runoff, eliminated soil erosion, and increased soil fertility over time, and maintained in the process both the productivity and profitability of the farm. And he explains this to me, and I said, well, Matt, that's the win-win solution everybody's looking for. How many farmers are using this system you've developed? And he said, almost none. He said, I could not have devised a program that affected more of the state's agribusinesses. And of course, it only took me a minute to think about that. I mean, think about it. An 85% reduction in fertilizer use. How does Koch Industries and the other fertilizer manufacturers feel about that? A 97% reduction in herbicide use. Monsanto is not going to be happy with that. They're not going to be happy with having less land planted in corn and soybeans. They're the seeds they sell. The fact that there might be a small increase in corn and soybean costs because you're not growing them as much isn't going to make the factory farms that use them for feed happy if they have to pay more for their feed. So Smithfield and Tyson are against you. Everyone is against you. And as he said, that's enough to pretty much stifle any widespread adoption of an innovation like this. And that's what I saw everywhere I went. If reforms or innovations put any kind of a dent in agribusiness profits, they were going to get torpedoed. And again, that's why the subtitle of my book is Agribusiness, Family Farmers, and the Battle for the Future of Food, because that contradiction between family farmers and agribusiness is really the one we have to wage and we have to win. Agribusiness, people don't realize that agribusiness in Washington spends more than the defense industry lobbying for its policies, for policies favorable to it. And at the state level, and you probably know this better than I in Minnesota, they overwhelm legislators with their lobbying and funding. That's only getting worse in the sense that the concentration of power at the top of these industries is getting more severe, right? I mean, seed companies have consolidated dramatically, with Bayer buying up Monsanto, DuPont and Dow merging, Syngenta being swallowed up by ChemChina. 3 companies now control 50% of the commercial market, and even more in these local markets. And that economic power conveys political power. So there's a real need and some hope that that finally a Democratic administration in Washington will take antitrust enforcement seriously in the areas of food and agriculture, but also that that some serious efforts will be undertaken to get money out of politics, because ultimately that's where the rubber hits the road. It's the reason that my colleague Francis Moore Lapay has gone from focusing primarily on food and agriculture to focusing on getting money out of politics and reforming our democracy. Farmers in Southern Africa are in no way losing hope, and you shouldn't either. They told me another agriculture is possible, and I'll stop there.
Well, thank you, Timothy. I really appreciate it. For those who want to ask questions, by the way, thanks so much for a wonderful presentation. It's very informative. And I'd like for people who have questions to either raise their hand either on the screen, or because I won't be able to see everybody, use the icon in the Zoom function, and we'll call on you in the order that they has it raised. But I'd like to ask the first question, if I may. You know, I think of the Gates Foundation is just like this wonderful organization who's fighting world hunger. And I'm sort of like surprised, you know, to hear the Gates Foundation in a negative light, because I obviously don't follow world food policy as closely as I probably should. What are the connections between big agribusiness and the Gates Foundation? Something I really wasn't aware of.
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. And I'll tell you, it is, it's literally the question that I've been asked at every single presentation I've ever done on my book. That people are surprised that Bill Gates and his foundation seem to be on the wrong side of history here. Bill Gates is a strong, I would say, dogmatic believer in technology as the solution to everything. And in his mind, the technologies of modern agriculture, which is what we do in the US, are the solution for agriculture everywhere. And there's a blind commitment to that vision, in spite of research that I've done myself that have shown that approach is really not succeeding. It's really failing. It's not raising productivity. It's not reducing hunger. It's like I saw in Zambia and elsewhere. He's very much invested, like literally invested, in agribusiness firms, personally and with the foundation, and cooperating with them he sees public-private partnerships with agribusiness as the way to bring quote unquote modern agriculture to Africa. And he's just wrong about it, but he's very dogmatic. And you also have to remember that the Gates Foundation, you know, Bill Gates didn't start as a philanthropist. He started as a technology monopolist, right? Microsoft. based on intellectual property, private ownership of intellectual property, and the benefits that accrue to that. He's very invested in this public-private partnership model that puts big companies in the driver's seat for a lot of policies.
Mark Tosin has a question for you.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. Very informative. I appreciate it. While you were speaking, I took the opportunity to look up something on Wikipedia. So here's my question. According to Wikipedia, many other species on the planet have a greater biomass than humans. Our species weighs in at about 385 million tons. Termites at 445 million tons, cattle at 520 million tons, fish at 800 to 2,000 million tons, and even earthworms at 3,800 to 7,600 million tons of biomass. So how do these numbers factor into your research regarding the use of Earth's resources by life on the planet?
Well, you know more than I do about those numbers, but I think I wrote a piece about Mozambique and Iowa and the climate coming for both of them. And the thing that I put in that piece is that what the Mozambicans have right that we need to learn from is that in diversity there is strength, and diversity in all forms. So that applies to our communities and embracing diversity in our communities as humans, but it also means that diversity in our soils, diversity in our crops, diversity in the many different interwoven ways that life sustains itself on the planet, quite apart from us, and on which we're dependent, but not at all appreciative. So I think the beauty of some of these projects that I saw in Africa, and not just Africa, I saw them in India, I saw them in Mexico as well, is that they're really embracing that diversity and thriving because of it. And the infuriating thing to me is that this agribusiness mantra of modernization just keeps getting driven down people's throats and forced on them by their governments in a lot of ways, rather than looking up and asking the question you're asking, which is, how do we all thrive on this planet together?
Can I follow up really quickly with just a question about cattle in particular? It would seem to me that the use of the resources on the planet having to do with the raising of cattle would be a major impact if we could alter that in such a way that to make feeding people easier.
Well, that's certainly true. And Francis Moore-Lapé's great breakthrough in Diet for a Small Planet was studying the ways in which the inefficiencies of feeding grain to cattle and other animals and eating the animals instead of feeding it to humans. I think that debate has evolved a lot since then, but so have the industries. I think there's a widespread recognition that we cannot keep farming animals the way we're farming animals. And that takes a lot of different forms, the kind of recommendations that come back from that. Ironically, in a place like Iowa, there were people saying, we need more cattle. And what was interesting about that is that that recommendation from Matt Liebman to turn a third of your land over to take it out of corn and soybeans and put it in grass, perfect for grazing. Grazing is perfect for enriching the soil if it's done in a sustainable way. And that is one of the ways that cattle could contribute to sustainability. The way we're doing it on these huge feedlots and massive grazing operations that are burning the Amazon to create more land for cattle is absolutely the wrong way to do it. So I think that's a well-placed concern.
Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, the next question will be from Jerry Smith, to be followed by Suzanne and then Christine. Jerry?
Yeah. It seems like the enemy here is capitalism, and particularly with its short-term perspective on profits, and a perspective that's so short-term that it doesn't consider long-term deterioration of the soil from which those profits are derived. But you could extend that and say it's really long-term, short-term, because I can imagine subsistence farmers doing the same thing, getting as much out of your soil on the assumption that, you know, we'll die before the soil does. So my question is, are there things that can be done? I'm not as opposed, I mean, not as concerned. I have some support for technology, maybe not as much as Bill Gates, but are there things that can be done with a capitalist kind of approach, which does have some advantages in terms of innovation? Are there things that can be done that lengthen out the time perspective, that maybe through societal governmental means make it so that capitalism has to be more focused on long-term effects on the planet and on the soil, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah,
Thoughts about that?
yeah, no, that's a really good observation. I am not at all anti-technology, and in fact, one of the great myths about that the industry actually propagates about this kind of ecological agriculture is that it's backward-looking and anti-science, that it's sort of going backwards to you know, ancient peasant traditions. It is trying to recapture some of the good parts of those traditions, like seed selection and seed saving and intercropping and these things. But they are relying on scientists to dramatically improve their productivity. I'll give you an example. One of the ways that in dry lands in Africa, they're restoring fertility in literally barren landscapes is by resuscitating trees that have been cut down, getting them to grow again, and then planting on those lands a mix of crops that rejuvenate the soil with the fertility needed to grow something like corn. And they're suddenly growing corn after 4 years on what had been considered desert. It can happen, but it's a scientific process informed by what have really been massive advances in ecological science. Part of the ecological science that's advanced so dramatically and that I'm most hopeful about is microbial science. Everybody says we don't know the half of, or even 10% of what's there in the microbial world, in the soil, in our guts, elsewhere, and that's going to answer a lot of questions. That's all valuable and important. The answer to your question about what can be done within the framework of a capitalist economy is regulation, like serious regulation. Like, we don't get it in the United States anymore because our political processes are so corrupted by money and politics that we can't even envision. It's hard for us to even envision a U.S. Department of Agriculture that says, no one can plant this way anymore. It's not sustainable. Here are incentives to do it another way. You're going to be penalized if you do it the way you're doing it now. Time for a change. That's the kind of climate emergency we face. I'd say it's the kind of food system emergency we face too. It really takes a very strong government willing to stand up to these companies.
But you need a public that's willing to say, yeah, we're going to sacrifice in the short term for long-term benefits. And I don't know that our public is there yet.
I don't know how many short-term sacrifices are needed from the public. I think that's overstated. You know, I think there undoubtedly would be adjustments. Some things would be more expensive, some things would be less expensive, some things would be less common. You know, it's sort of like eating seasonal food in season. That might become more normal, but that's in the grand scheme of sacrifices. We're not talking about big sacrifices for the public to do this.
Next question is Suzanne, then Christine, and then Mary. Suzanne?
Thanks again for your presentation. If you go to the University of Minnesota, there's a small museum that highlights prominent alumni. And one of the people they're most proud of is Norman Borlaug, father of the Green Revolution. Believe he won a Nobel Prize for that. How do you assess his contribution? Was it good and it got distorted along the way, or was it flawed in your view?
Oh, yeah. No, I start my Iowa chapter in the book with, after being in Iowa and just seeing the mythology that surrounds Norman Borlaug, it evoked a religious experience for me. It was like, you had the World Food Prize building as like a temple. You had Norman Borlaug as the saint who everyone was revering. You had the leader of the World Food Prize, Kenneth Quinn, as a leading disciple and promoter of the faith. It was astonishing and incredibly well-funded and well put together. Like, it's a package that they've got going there. But the more research I did, the more I saw that in fact, I have a piece coming out next week with a Malaysian colleague on the ways that the first Green Revolution actually has been so mythologized as to be unrecognizable from the reality. And the reality is that, yeah, he created these new seeds, and yes, they increased production in some places with lots of fertilizer, but they didn't really save the world. And in fact, a lot of the places in India where the Green Revolution was first considered a massive success are now experiencing some of the worst, strongest farmer protests. If you've read about the farm protests in India, they've been occupying the streets of Delhi for now 2 months in protest of changes in farm policies. But it's partly that the Green Revolution destroyed the water, the soil, the pesticide resistance, with all the farmers found themselves in debt, getting lower yields, paying more for the inputs. Not a great formula. So I think the Borlaug legacy is, what I came to appreciate being in Iowa is that he was an incredibly creative and dogged researcher. Like, he did a lot to do what he did. He had to go through a lot to make it happen. The legacy, though, in practice is not so positive.
Christine, you have a question?
Yes, I thank you again for your wonderful presentation, and your conversation with Mark's question and about diversity and such prompted something. I just read Doug Tallamy's book, I forget what it's called, something about nature's best hope. And it's speaking more about landscaping and such, and the importance of having natives planted, and particularly the web of interconnections of things. They're built to go together. You may not notice it, but the non-human life notices when something's wrong or missing. And your example in Malawi was talking about, I think these were native plants more typically. So they're talking about having them for generations. How does that interplay then in America, where we have such massive quantities? It seemed like some of the places you were discussing it was a smaller production operation. How does more natives or more interconnection to what has worked historically interplay in American agriculture at all? Or your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and an interesting challenge. It's exactly the challenge that Matt Liebman has made his life's work of at Iowa State University. In other words, he describes his task as how do I design reforms along the margins of this industrial agriculture behemoth that can move the larger ecology in a good direction, not to, full diverse production like you'd see in a place like Malawi. But you know, like his idea about this adding a third rotation is pretty revolutionary. And it's revolutionary because grasses are native and they're deep rooted, and so they filter the water, they restore the soil, they change the microbial structure of the soil. If you have animals grazing them, then their manure is doing the same thing. If you then rotate your lands among grasses and corn and soybeans, you have an even more rich diversity there. And I think he would answer your question saying there are ways to, you know, farmers in the Midwest would consider them radical reforms, but they're not. They're entirely feasible changes in farming practices that, with the right kind of government support, could make a huge difference in water pollution, air pollution, climate resilience, pest resistance, animal biodiversity, right? The loss of milkweed and the loss of the monarch butterfly. All of that, you put some prairie, he has a different project where you put strips of prairie grass on land deemed to be unprofitable to farm. And that's one of the answers to the earlier question about technology. One valuable use of precision agriculture, which goes through a farm and actually really identifies not square yard by square yard, but close, where you're getting good returns on your farm, can show that sections of farms are not profitable to farm. If you can tell you, Matt's been talking farmers out of planting those strips and planting them in prairie grasses. And he finds that strips of prairie grass will even dramatically improve the reduction in soil erosion, the reduction in water pollution, all kinds of, and biodiversity generally. So I guess that's as good as I can answer that question.
I think Mary McLeod, do you have a question, Mary?
Well, Suzanne asked the Borlaug question I was going to ask, so let me switch. Let me go on to asking what are the two most important things we can do? And I'm suggesting two because the first thing you name may not be considered to be in our wheelhouse.
Because you don't trust me?
No, because we know ourselves and we know what we can do well and what we can't. So I'm asking for two things that we can do to make a difference.
Yeah, well, I'll channel my colleague Francis Moore-Lepay and say, get money out of politics and get agribusiness out of the policy space, because it's very hard to overcome, to get anything. It's very hard to make changes at the farm level that are meaningful at the landscape level. So you need government on the side of good in this, and it's hard to get government on the side of good without limiting the influence of those who have power now.
Do you believe that Joe Biden intends, or that his intentions are good at least? He may not be able to get something through Congress, but that his intentions toward agriculture policy and global warming are good?
I think there are definitely new openings there with the Biden administration, not just because he's not Trump, but because he's no, but I just think reality is imposing itself, right, on all of us. Like climate change is a much more clear and present danger for all of us. We see that now. We see the ways that that agriculture, it's only in recent years that they've really documented our food system's contributions to global warming. And so now that's a much more front and center issue. You know, he's brought a mix, from my perspective, a mixture of, it's a mixed bag who he's brought into his administration on the agriculture, trade, environment side, but there's some very good people in there. He has Merrick Garland, people don't realize, his new attorney general, has a really good track record on antitrust enforcement. And it would be wonderful if he cut loose an antitrust person on agriculture. That could really be a game changer, because it could put the big agribusiness firms back on their heels a little bit and create some space for alternatives. I don't know if that's really answering your question.
I think it is. Thank you very much.
Well, we just have a few minutes left, but I'd like to get a couple more questions in from Molly and then Joseph. Molly?
Thank you so much for your terrific presentation, Tim. I hope this isn't too far off the subject, but recently I was just reading that the World Trade Organization has a new president, a general director. First time ever woman, first time from Africa. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on if the World Trade Organization will be pursuing a new trade agenda. I mean, something that is considering the poor countries and what's happening with the climate crisis.
Yeah, no, nobody talks about the World Trade Organization anymore because it was so marginalized by the Trump administration, but marginalized a little bit even before that, because people forget that the World Trade Organization engages in these so-called rounds of negotiations in which they try and hammer out a whole range of agreements. And they say nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. And that means that you negotiate all these things, countries make trade-offs, and then you approve this final package. The last one, launched in 2001, was called the Development Round, specifically to favor developing countries. And the US under George Bush and then later under Obama really pulled back from making any commitments there. So those negotiations just completely stalled. I would love to see the new Director General really take that mantle up again and say this is an unfulfilled promise to developing countries. That's a heavy lift because the geopolitics of it all have changed in such dramatic ways. But there are things that can be done, and I hear hopeful things about her leadership. That she's a very active leader. That she's a true leader. That she has vision and she makes things happen. One of the first things that she needs to make happen, and this is outside the realm of agriculture, is developing countries have petitioned to have the WTO waive intellectual property protections on the COVID vaccine. You may have read about it.
Absolutely.
It is scandalous that the US is still on the wrong side of that one.
Right.
We're one of the main countries blocking it. And just to bring Bill Gates back into it, there was a great article, detailed article in the New Republic that detailed how his interventions in the vaccine development process basically throttled the possibilities of open access vaccines when they got developed. Again, it's this whole public-private partnership model. And it puts the private sector in charge of the innovation, and you promise them the profits in return. You can get innovation, but you need the public. So you need public, it needed to serve public health in a case of a vaccine. And so there's a battle going on for the soul of Joe Biden. If you want to make a call, that's a good one to make a call on. Stop blocking open access to vaccine technologies, because there are, what saved Africa from the AIDS crisis was open access to the cocktail of medications that were developed to treat HIV. And that was a 5-year campaign so that Indian pharmaceutical manufacturers could manufacture the same drugs for a 20th of the cost that were being charged on the private market. That saved Africa in the HIV crisis. It can save the developing world again on COVID. There's this horrifying statistic, you may have read it, that I've gotten my 2 vaccines. I'm very pleased to say, I just got my second one a couple weeks ago. Only 0.2% of vaccines have been given to people in developing countries at this point. That's just horrifying.
It's a crime.
There you go.
It's a crime that the US is against. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Well, of course, we're running a little over, but I'd like to get a couple quick questions in from Joseph and Barb.
Yeah,
We'll cut it off at that point.
okay.
Maybe like to. Go ahead, Joseph.
Okay, yeah, you've talked about synthetic fertilizers, you've talked about GMOs and Monsanto. You talked about general innovation and it from the grassroots level. So my question was with regards to the technology of GMOs, do you think that they're inherently wrong, they're the wrong choice to make, or do you think they can be restructured like vaccines in a more positive way by scrapping intellectual property and things like that?
Yeah, that's interesting. I don't actually think intellectual property is the biggest obstacle to making GMOs useful in agriculture. I think, I mean, certainly public sector research as opposed to private research would be beneficial. I think the problem is, and the research, I think it can be valuable. I think the problem is in the hands of the private sector, there's a rush to market, right? As soon as they get something that they can get a patent on and they want to start selling it. And that really works against the kind of precaution that I think we should all observe in relation to GMOs. I think we're one big unconsenting experiment, human experiment right now with GMOs. We don't know a lot of what long-term impacts are, and we can't know. They've never been labeled. You have no clue who, you couldn't do an experiment right now that segregates people who have eaten diets heavy in GMOs from people who haven't. You can't really, you could do a little bit of that at the ecological level by looking at crop mixes and the impacts on soils and on plant and animal life. And those aren't good. Those don't show well. So I guess, I don't know if that's a good answer to your question, but I think getting research is great. Taking a profit motive out of rushing research into the field is what I think is most needed. And that's more compatible with public sector research than it is with private sector research.
Yeah, and that's absolutely what I've seen with regards to where innovation comes from, like in the biomedical area. I think an economist came out that 85% or so of the top medical innovation and biomedical comes from public sector research. So it just really doesn't work well with regards to the capitalist system. But yeah, thank you very much for your talk.
Let's have Barb, if you still have a question, Barb, and then followed by Audrey, and that'll be it. And then we'll go to social hour. Barb?
Yeah, again, thank you, of course, for your presentation. I took notes and I'm going to look some stuff up. My question is about organic food that is basically factory farmed food. The stuff that you get in Costco and Walmart, that it's, they got all these huge organic sections that sell really inexpensive organic food. And I really have my suspicions about that, especially because I had been told by someone who raises grass-fed beef that included in the definition of grass is the byproduct of making ethanol. So the corn junk that's left over can be fed to beef and it's still called grass-fed.
Yeah, there've been I think there's a lot of gaming of the organic standards. which were initially fairly strong, although they had loopholes that people worried about, and people have driven big big combines through those loopholes, as Big Ag has seen it as an opportunity to get higher profits and higher prices for such products. That the downside for farmers, I think, is lost a lot of the time. Like, consumers are worried about, what am I really getting here? If I'm paying extra for organic, am I getting, what you're getting is something that you can be mostly assured is pesticide and chemical free, but you're not assured of much else. And so one of the things that has roiled the dairy industry, which I know is near and dear to Minnesota's heart, but also other parts of the Midwest, is the bankruptcy of a lot of organic dairies. And they've gone bankrupt because of factory farmed dairies that are going all in on big organic feedlots, which they can only make the case that they qualify for organic on a bunch of very fallacious and misleading claims, and nobody's cracked down on them. And they've essentially driven the organic premium for milk down to the point that it's bankrupting local family farmers. And they've increased the supply coming from places like Texas and California, where the biggest dairies are. You hear farmers in the Midwest, organic farmers that have been supplying Organic Valley or other suppliers, saying that their buyers don't want their stuff anymore because they've been told they need to buy it all from one source, and their one source is one of these factory farms. And so that's why I say it really ties in with the excessive market power of agribusiness, because they can create these contracts that say, stop buying from your local farmer. And local farmers, I mean, the bankruptcy wave in dairy farming, family dairy farming, is alarming. It's one of the real crises in agriculture right now.
Yeah, I think that's why it's so important to buy local, and to buy, to go shop at the Wedge Food Co-op, which their stuff is organic, instead of getting it at Costco and Walmart. And, I put in the chat some meat organic places, and you can go visit them. So that they welcome visitors. So you can see that their pigs and chickens and cows are all pastured all the time. Yeah. But thank you.
Yep.
I want to thank you again, Timothy, for your wonderful talk. I think Audrey, I want to turn it over to Audrey now, the program over to Audrey. She may have a last question, but if not, Audrey will lead us into our social hour. So thank you so much, Timothy.
Thank you.
Yes, I want to say thank you too. This subject is near and dear to my heart. And yes, I want to ask one last question. I do think that industrial agriculture is the problem, corporate agriculture. We've got to stop it. And so I love your suggestions about getting money out of politics and trying to take on corporate agriculture. I have a lot of questions I could have asked, but I want to go back to Bill Gates, because these private philanthropists, such as Bill Gates, are really game changers in so many areas. And now when I see, the US is in a great mess, because we've already gone totally industrial. And so is there a way that we can tell Bill Gates the error of his ways? I mean, I think he cares about some other good values. And so to hear that he is so much behind these endeavors, and that governments in developing countries are taken by him and pushing policy that is detrimental to people's livelihoods, and as well as the planet. So I don't know, is anyone working on him?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of, it's the thing that you have to realize, and it's probably the most, at the deeper level, it's one of the most pernicious aspects of the rise of the power of philanthropists like Bill Gates is that it's a problem that they ever got so rich. So you had these, monopoly capitalists. His was coming out of Microsoft, but you can pick other ones, generating super profits from their monopolies. And then those monopolies and those profits become an independent source of wealth and power that you'd be shocked how unaccountable the Gates Foundation is to anyone. It has 3 trustees, Bill, Melinda, used to be Bill's father, and now it's Warren Buffett. That's it. That's it. There's no board. There's no one to go to. If you wanted to say, as we're saying, I'm currently right in the middle of a campaign right now to show just how ineffective AGRA, the Alliance for Green Revolution in Africa, has been. AGRA is about to go on a fundraising campaign where it's going to try to raise $1 billion more after it's basically wasted its first $1 billion. 2/3 of it comes from the Gates Foundation. You cannot get the Gates Foundation to answer a question about the efficacy of that investment. You can't get it to share the evaluation it commissioned in 2016, which we know from Freedom of Information Act requests. We can't get hold of that document, and they won't share it to say, see, this is why those investments are worth the money. It's the most unaccountable. There's going to be a campaign in which some funders are actually going to write the Gates Foundation and say, you're not following foundation best practices of accountability and transparency and monitoring and evaluation. You need to be more accountable. Again, he's pretty impenetrable. And it's partly that, you just can't imagine. He's very conscious of using his wealth and benevolence to get a seat at the table. So, I'm not making it up when there's the G20 group of countries, which is the most powerful, biggest economies in the world. When they meet, there are 21 people there. He is treated like he's a country. He has a seat at the G20 table. It's, he's not elected by anybody. No, just because he's rich and supposedly benevolent, we're supposed to think that he should get to say what we do. It's a really bad societal development that we have these ultra rich people in the first place, and then that they can cast themselves as our saviors just because they individually have a great idea. They think nobody gets to vote on their great idea. It just is not a good form of democracy. In the course of doing this Africa research, I had somebody who was going to do a review of my book in a Kenyan newspaper. And they came to me and said, my editor won't publish the review. And I said, why? And he said, because Gates funds the news outlet. And they don't want to do anything critical of anything that Gates funds. I was like, and on his balance sheet, he's checking that off as funding a free press, right? That's the free press. He's supporting the independent media. And there you are with independent voices being stifled. Anyway, I think it's a really good question. If you want to get more, you all should, anyone who would like to be on my distribution list for new articles I write or information that comes out, please pass along your emails to me and I'll put you on that list. This summer, we will be involved in a very active campaign to go straight at Gates and AGRA for that lack of accountability and to undermine that funding.
Oh, thank you for that. That's good to hear that there's something trying to be done. Anyway, thank you again so very much. This was really, well, I think a lot of people really liked it, but I really, really liked it. Anyway,
I really liked it too. So let me thank you. Your questions were great. I'm sorry I couldn't be in the room with you to enjoy your presence and hear you laugh if you ever laughed at anything I said. We all miss that.
yes, yes, you actually had a few lighthearted points there. I chuckled. Anyway, yes. So again, thank you so much for coming. I understand that you have to leave and can't stay to chat with us some more, but.